Hey there, this is Cindy, and I'm really glad you're here, and I can't wait to share today's episode with you. But before we dive in, though, I want to remind you of a few ways that we can work together if you're looking to uplevel your negotiation skills. And let's face it, all of life is a negotiation. So upleveling our skills will always pay off. I have one-on-one group and online coaching programs available to help you better leverage your natural power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. So feel free to check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com if that's something that sounds at all interesting to you. But on to today's programming. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Tina Baxter. We're going to be talking about negotiating with our aging parents today. And this is a subject near and dear to my heart these days, especially as my mom is being diagnosed with dementia and recently placed in a long-term care facility. It's been a challenging process, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Tina today. So welcome, Tina. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know Tina, she's an advanced practice registered nurse and also a board certified gerontological nurse practitioner. That is a mouthful. And she focuses on the mental health needs of adults and geriatric patients. And Tina's been a registered nurse for over 20 years, a nurse practitioner for over 14 years, and she's the owner of Baxter Professional Services LLC. And it's an interesting company. It's a consulting firm that provides legal nurse consulting services for attorneys and insurance professionals. And she also does wellness and chronic disease and stress management coaching. So, Tina, why don't you kickstart us off here by just tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, and what made you want to pursue this career?
Okay, well, I have always been interested in healthcare in one way or another and in medicine. And as a young person, I would think I was in junior high, I volunteered at the nursing home through my church with my mom. And that's where I really fell in love with older adults.
Yeah.
Because they had such rich stories to share.
Yeah.
And very interesting lives. And I wanted to learn more about what made them tick and how did they get to where they were and what was their life like way back when, because I was in junior high. So if you were over 30, it was way back when.
So true.
and I really love having that lived experience and being able to learn from that. And so I learn as much from my residents and my clients as they learn from me when I tell them about their health conditions. So.
Oh, that's so nice. And really, that's a shout out for those kind of programs as well. I had forgot about that until you said they used to have programs in my high school where you could go over to there was a nursing home next door and just spend time and read and engage. And we often forget and lose touch. So I love that. I've been hearing some shocking stats. I went to a presentation recently and they had said, turn to your right, turn to your left, whoever you came with here today, chances are that one of you is going to end up getting diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's today. And, my husband and I were both pointing at each other. And I don't know if those stats are accurate, but I'd love if you have any tips for our listeners on, how they can stave off dementia for themselves or Alzheimer's, or at least better protect our mental health, I guess. Any tips you've got on that?
First thing I would say is activity, activity, activity. Stay active, not just physically active, but also mentally active. So things that you can do to help you work those crossword puzzles or Sudoku or those, if you're into video games, there's a lot of great video games that require you to use math skills or to find objects. And so it's keeping your brain engaged. Most of my residents, the ones that are doing really well, even though they may have dementia, what's helping them to stay to a place where they're able to do things for themselves as long as possible is that they're active, they're engaged. Social isolation is one of the biggest factors that causes a decline in older adults.
Okay.
So keep out there and stay engaged with other people, having that interaction with other people. So activity is the biggest thing.
Yeah. Well, geez, you just gave me a little jolt there, because I've got to say, I hate that whole crossword puzzle thing and that. So I'm going to start getting more engaged. Sudoku, I don't even get the concept, frankly, and I've always just told myself, well, I'm still active and working and whatever, but maybe I better dust off some of those puzzles and take another look at them. But you just trigged on something that I hadn't thought to go to today, but I think it's worth spending a minute to chat about. And that is, what is the impact of the pandemic in your view? Because in this, let's face it, we've had a pretty prolonged period of social isolation for most people. What's the impact generally you're finding in mental health, and in particular for our elderly?
In general, I would say a lot of people are having problems adjusting to meeting with people again and being social active.
Yeah.
Some of my clients are afraid to leave their homes
Yeah.
because they don't want to get sick. They may have had their vaccine, they may wear their mask, but it's still that I don't want to be around large crowds of people. And I have to admit, myself was a little apprehensive on my first plane ride.
Yeah.
Pandemic, it was, but I think that not watching the news, I had one particular client that watched the news all day, every day.
Yeah.
And she was more and more anxious. And I said,
Yeah.
turn the news off, watch the weather, watch the traffic, and maybe the local story on the dog show or whatever. But other than that, in sports, turn it off, don't watch the news, and stop focusing on that. And then that would help some of that apprehension of going outside. And some of my clients have agoraphobia, so they really are afraid to leave their home. So adding that pandemic on there has made it even harder. We had some clients that were doing well and were starting to get out and meet people and go to activities and things. And now, because of COVID, they were isolated. So we've got to start all back over again and, get them working to get back out of the house. Again, with older adults, unfortunately, it's particularly if you're an elder and you're at home, make sure you're checking in on them, right? Because things could happen that they could have a fall, they could get ill, and no one's checking on them, and they're afraid to leave their home. Because I've had clients that don't want to come to the doctor because they're afraid they're going to get sick.
That's true.
Sick people are there. And I've had, and with our nursing homes, oftentimes it was the staff. The staff was the only person that they could see for a long time. I have a elder that I take care of, and she's in a nursing home, and we had to do her visits outside her window.
Yeah.
And that's how we spent her birthday.
Yeah.
We sent her birthday present in and waved at her from the window, and we talked on the phone. Yeah. And so, that contact is so important. So the staff becomes their point of contact and their families. It was at the height of the pandemic, it was so bad that they were isolated in their rooms. They weren't allowed to go and congregate even with their peers. Yeah. So there's a lot of emerging research about this that's coming out, and we just need to make sure that we're keeping people connected as much as possible.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me sort of unpack some of that. I mean, for the news, I think that's great advice. We don't want to keep our head stuck in the sand, but having said that, our media has become so alarmist, and it really is causing an increase in, mental health problems for people. I mean, anxiety levels are at all-time highs. Morale in workplaces certainly is at all-time lows. Suicide rates are on a dramatic increase. And I think that crosses all ages. I mean, we're seeing that with our youth, from even very young kids through to the elderly as well. And I chuckled when you'd said about the airplane, because I remember I did my TEDx talk, and it was sort of at the peak of the pandemic. And I thought, I'm not missing this opportunity. So I ended up having to take a flight, out of country to do the TEDx talk. And this was at a time when we would have been fined if we had, you weren't allowed to have 10 people at your home. You couldn't have anybody outside your immediate family. And yet there was not a space on that plane. They had us packed in like sardines with people that you don't know within inches. And I'm like, well, this is an interesting double standard that we're seeing here. But also that isolation piece for the elderly. And sadly, it is still going on. I know at my mom's long-term care facility, I've been kicking and screaming and advocating about it because, as you say at the beginning, they were isolated in their rooms for a long period of time. My mom came in after that, but anytime they think that she sounds like she's stuffed up or she sneezes or anything, they immediately slap them into isolation where they're not allowed in the dining room. They restrict their sort of visiting. And on those occasions, oh my gosh, Tina, I see a dramatic decline in her cognition. Like from day to day, it has a very profound impact. And I worry that we haven't considered the long-term concept. Everybody's in protective mode, and all these decision makers are like, oh, we don't want to risk COVID. So we're slapping all these policies on, I think sometimes without thinking really about what the long-term potentially adverse consequences are. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Not to get too political about it, but
that was a very interesting point about every time you have a cough or a sneeze. I was at the doctor's today and I had my mask on, but I sneezed because I have allergies. And, we want to be protective. We want to protect others from spreading. I think part of the issue is that in long-term care, there hasn't been really good infection control policies in place. And then they may have the policies in place, but not have the resources to actually carry it out. So when the pandemic started, one of the things that they were running out of was PPE. I had a nurse, a DON, call me and say, do you know where I can get any PPE? Because I have a COVID unit. I don't have the equipment to take care of them and keep my staff safe. And no one will work on this unit but me. Wow. And so I need this PPE. And fortunately, you had some companies out there that were trying to take advantage and selling substandard stuff. So, but a lot of the supplies that were coming in were going to the hospitals, right? And so that left long-term care kind of in the wind, trying to figure out how to get it, because they would get it on the, they would be like second wave. It's like hospital first, then maybe long-term care and other agencies. So that's part of the issues. But as far as for older adults having to be quarantined for that time and the drop in the cognition, that's understandable because you're disrupting their routine.
Yeah.
So usually someone with dementia and memory loss, you want to make sure that you keep them into a fairly good routine where they know, okay, in the morning we're going to get up, we're going to have our bath, we're going to have our breakfast, I'm going to get dressed, right? And so you may vary a little bit in some things, but you want to make sure that they're keeping a good routine so they go to bed at the same time and get up at the same time.
Yeah.
Any of those things that disrupt that can cause a further decline and more confusion, because now we're dealing with maybe some sleep changes. They don't have that interaction that they were having with other people and be able to talk with people, keep up those verbal skills, all those different things. And what happens when you're bored, as a person that's healthy, when you're bored, your mind kind of wanders.
Yeah, that's true.
So why wouldn't that happen to someone with dementia? And a lot of times they have those, what I like to call blank times, where there's no activity really going on and they kind of lose time because they, you've seen it, they'll stare off into space and you wonder what they're thinking about. Well, they probably aren't thinking about much of anything.
Yeah.
Sometimes, they are, but a lot of times they aren't, or they'll get lost in memories.
Yeah.
Right. And they'll reminisce and they'll stay there. So I had one of my residents at one time told me that Nixon was still president.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's where she was back there.
Oh, and it's funny you say that. That really resonates with me, Tina, because as they kept doing this isolation thing with my mom, like when I was visiting, there every day and having that contact, she'd get a little confused, but it was really quick to be able to ground her and bring her back. And we were both actually able to laugh about it, which was great. But then when she was isolated, all of a sudden she'd be back 30 years ago. And she was thinking my sister and I were still young kids and we were missing. And she'd be calling me at night in a panic going, oh my God, where's Cindy? And she's never not knowing who I am, right? I'm like, Cindy and Dale, I can't find them. And that's my sister and I. And I'm thinking, what the heck, right? So it was this dramatic adjustment. Now we're considered, I am, you're younger than I am, but I'm considered that sandwich generation where you've got sort of that pressures from that you sort of aging parents and you've still got the pressure from the kids. So I wonder, do you have any tips for our listeners out there on how to navigate that difficult terrain, with our own parents who may be experiencing that early onset dementia or any other geriatric issues?
I say, first of all, give yourself a measure of grace in this period of your life, right?
Yes.
And you may have to make some choices and some changes and realize that this is a season and the season will change. And so I tell people, don't try to take on a bunch of new activities and things if you don't have to.
Yeah.
So maybe having a schedule, that has mom's appointments, kids' appointments, right? And so who's going to be where and who's going to do what, so that you don't get confused, and color coded, because that's helpful. I'm kind of dealing with that because my husband's ill and my father's ill. So, and then my mother got ill and was in the
Oh,
hospital in between all of this. So I'm trying to keep everyone's appointments, including my own,
yeah.
up.
Oh,
And it was a little overwhelming at that time when everybody was sick and I had to try to navigate who's going to get first dibs and what was happening. And so I think taking things one day at a time, and that's what I would tell people. People would call and say, oh, can you do this? No, I can't do this right now. I can't do this today because I'm dealing with these things and I'm taking it one day at a time. So, and don't be afraid to say no to some
yeah.
things that you,
Yeah.
and maybe it's not completely no, but maybe it's a not now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's okay. Yeah.
I love that. That is such an important negotiation, that negotiation with ourselves about what we're going to tolerate, right? I mean, the power of a positive no, and learning there are loads of ways you can say no that are, thanks so much for thinking of me. And I would love that at any other time, but now it's just not going to work for me, right? There are all kinds of ways, but know those boundaries so that you don't end up burning yourself out where you're not going to be any use to anybody. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Practice self-care.
Yes.
Very important. Caregivers forget that they need care also.
Yeah.
So if you could do something like bring in home health care to maybe sit with mom or sit with dad or help get their bath or maybe help get their meal, or go and sign them up for Meals on Wheels so that you'll
Yeah.
know that they're getting nutritious meals according to their diet, and they'll have that, then that takes a load off of your plate. And then you're able to spend time having fun with them,
Yeah.
right? Enjoying them instead of having the pressure and the stress of having to do it all.
That is
So
such great advice, because we get stuck in that to do errand mode and then we lose that connection. You lose that relationship that you need and they need.
yes.
So now what is the likely progression of the disease? And again, I don't need you to get too technical, but like what can we reasonably expect of our loved ones once that process starts, if somebody's being diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's?
Well, often the first signs will be a general forgetfulness. Maybe they'll forget where they put their keys.
Oh.
Yeah, you'll find it in bizarre places, like it's in the freezer.
Yeah.
Hmm. Or in the stove.
Yeah.
They may do things like become suspicious of others. They misplace something and say, "Oh, someone came in my house and stole my hat," and then the hat's on
Yeah.
the bed. So they may lose things, and they may get lost going somewhere. So my aunt, for instance, she got into the car and was driving somewhere, and in the middle of her driving, forgot where she was going, didn't know where she was, didn't know how to get back. So she just stops the car in the middle of the street and starts bawling. And
Oh,
so my uncle gets there. She at least was able to call him,
yeah.
gets there and takes her and brings her home. But that was the beginning of understanding she was starting dementia.
Yeah.
So those things can happen. And then you can have some mood changes and some personality changes that may occur in the very beginning stages. So I had a retired preacher as one of my residents once, and sweetest man in the world, right? Never cursed a day in his life,
I've heard that.
but he got dementia. And this man cursed like a sailor, and his family was mortified. But I said, you have to understand that piece of our brain, that part of our brain that keeps us from, acting on those impulses isn't working anymore. And so he may act out on those impulses. And if he's frustrated about something because I think he was trying to fix something or put something together that he normally would be able to do very easily, and he couldn't get it. He got frustrated and he just let it out.
Yeah.
Words I haven't heard before. I'm like, that's interesting. But yeah, so I explained that to them, that this can happen, but over time, the physical changes start to happen. And that's where you'll start seeing things like a loss of bowel, bladder, incontinence, that type of thing, maybe forgetting how to eat or what to eat. So they have to have more cueing and reminders, and they may have to end up being fed, and then they might lose the ability to walk, or they would be what I like to call the happy wanderer who never sits still.
Yeah. Okay.
And that may go on for a while. And all of these stages can come on gradually, or they can change rapidly. It just depends on the type of dementia that they have
Okay.
And if they have any other exacerbating illnesses, such as heart disease or pulmonary disease, and they get sick, and that might bring them down on a stage. They might never get back up to where they were, and they may not recover as fast. So
Okay.
those are some of the things.
Well, thanks. And I'm really glad you mentioned about those personality changes, because I think family we all have this idealized version of what family is supposed to be, but most families in my experience are dysfunctional to a greater or lesser extent. And we have family can be so triggering. And when a loved one, especially a parent, starts suddenly being engaging in behavior that's really nasty or abusive or atypical, it can be so triggering difficult. So I think it's healthy to recognize this is part of the process and then find those ways to be able to negotiate or navigate through that. And speaking of that, I think one of the hardest things for people to negotiate or navigate is fear, right? So I'd love your insights on, what are some of the biggest fears that are faced by either people dealing with dementia and or for their loved ones, and how do you recommend that people address that and move forward?
First off, acknowledging it. Acknowledge that it's scary. For instance, I had a resident, she was a music teacher, and she had a piano in her room, and then suddenly she can't remember how to play.
Wow.
And so every time the disease takes something like that from you, that's a loss that you have to grieve.
Yeah.
And understand that there's a process, there's a grief process for that. And so, helping them through that and understanding as a family member that maybe they're not meaning to, but they need to sometimes talk about it. And sometimes we don't want to talk about it. Family,
Yeah.
we don't want to hear about how they're feeling, but it's important to be there and to listen and to support. So, for instance, I had a lady that had heart failure and dementia. She was a resident, and her family kept her at home as long as they could. But when it came time, they put her in the assisted living, and then decided not to tell her she was in assisted living because they thought, well, maybe her dementia is bad enough, she won't figure it out. So they were actually saying, well, we're going to take you home eventually one day. We'll take you home eventually one day. Gaslighting her, right? And of course, they didn't tell me that that's what they were doing because I figured she moved in to stay.
Of course.
So when she asked me if she can leave, I said, well, I thought you were here to stay. She said, no, my daughter said, if I gain weight, I can go home. I said, well, you gain weight, but it's because of your heart failure. You've gained fluid weight. It's not actual weight, but I haven't heard that you were being discharged. So, I'll ask and find out. Well, she called her daughter because she knew something. The jig was up. She knew something was wrong. And the daughter was upset with me, but I said, well, I'm not in the habit of lying to my residents.
Yeah.
So they asked but what came out of that, the woman accepted where she was because she realized this is where she needed to be. And then a few days later, she was like, hey, how come I don't get to eat in the dining room with everybody else? And we're like, you can go to the dining room if you want to. Her family was afraid that she'd figure out where she was and she'd be unhappy. So they were keeping her in her room.
Yeah. Sometimes with the best of intentions, we just, my gosh. And I love that you've mentioned grieving, because I think it's so important for people to recognize that this is a form of grieving. We always associate grief with death, but there's often a very profound, sometimes more profound grieving process as we lose certain things. I think that's so important. And also, I really want to put a pin in when you talked about that communication piece, that, negotiating, communicating both with our loved one, but also with the caregivers and having those open lines of communication. Like the fact that you didn't know, what the story was they were telling her kind of created a potential disaster there. So 2 really great points. And Tina, I'd love if you could touch on, because when you were talking about that grieving, what do we know about the level of awareness experienced by people diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's, or related conditions? Like I remember reading that book, Still Alice, and it really rocked me, because that idea that we're all talking around people as if they have no awareness when they have very high levels of awareness about it. And I'd love your insights on that as a nurse.
Oftentimes they're aware of things that are not right, not quite happening like they should.
Yeah.
But they may not be able to express it.
Yeah.
So it may come out in different ways. So it may come out in acting out or lashing out because they're not able to express it. So for instance, we had another one of my residents, and he had moved in with his wife. His wife had died. He had her ashes, and he would carry her around. And we were afraid that he would drop it. So we had it put up in his closet. he would come and ask us where his wife was, and we would explain to him, well, she died. We'd show him the urn, and we explained that he would grieve all over again because he would forget. So we got to the place where, because it wasn't worth him being upset every time, we called the nephew. The nephew came and took the ashes so that he wouldn't lose them or do whatever he did with them. And we would just tell him, well, she's shopping.
Yeah.
And he'd be like, oh, okay. And so he was looking forward to her coming. And he would say, well, boy, she's been shopping a long time. And I said, well, it's almost Christmas time. And you know how us women get when we shop. And he's like, yeah, that's true. That's right.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah. So I said, I'm pretty sure she'll be here tomorrow because he's going to forget. Yeah. And what was happening is he was reliving that grieving process every time we told him. So we opted to let him know, hey, she's shopping. She may be shopping in heaven, but she's shopping, right?
Yeah.
But they recognize that when you take away things like the keys, suddenly they're not able to drive. You take the keys away from them. That's a very big thing. That's a loss of independence. And they recognize each time something like that's taken away, they've lost some independence. I had a lady that her family picked her up, took her to the assisted living, told her, well, first of all, they told her, we're going out to dinner, Mom. While they took her out, one side of the family took her out to dinner. The other members of the family went to her house, packed up all her stuff, took it to the assisted living. Then the daughter took her and said, here's your new place. Yeah. See ya. Oh, because they didn't visit for about almost a month because they wanted her to get used to being in a facility. They didn't even tell her she was going. So obviously this woman was very mad, and she was still very much with it. And she happened to be very big in the local political scene. So she was threatening to sue everyone.
Wow.
Make phone calls. So we had to talk to the family. That's how not to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't do it that way. But we were able to help that woman because she was used to being in that political scene and very social and that type of thing. We turned her into an ambassador at the facility. And so she would tour with new residents and show them around and So.
Oh, that's so good. And I love it. And I want us to kind of circle back at some point about the do's and don'ts as well. Okay. Wow. That really resonated with me when you said about that grieving all over and how challenging that is. Like, I know with my mom, she keeps jumping back like 30 years, right? And she is so like, she doesn't remember where she lived for the last 20 years, but she remembers where every stick of furniture was from, 30, 40 years ago. But my dad died after that. So, and he died young. He was only 52, died of a heart attack. And oh my gosh, it's like a re-grieving every time my mom is reminded that he's not here anymore. And the same, I'm probably going to get myself in trouble sharing this here publicly, but had a big issue with my sister where she went and wrote a series of checks on my mom's account. It was like basically stealing from her own mom. It was horrible. My mom was devastated, as you can imagine. And then it's one of those catch-22s where she would forget about it. And it's like, gosh, do I remind her of it where she gets re-traumatized over again? But I also don't want her being vulnerable to being taken advantage of again. And so they are hard calls. And it's that independence piece you talked about so beautifully, Tina, because I know for my mom, it's like she wants that bank card, even though she's not going out anywhere, right? But she's like, where's my bank card? And where that sense of loss, I think recognizing that is so important. So thanks so much for sharing that. And I'd love if you can speak to, I call it the art of negotiation. But
before you go real quick, I just want to tell you something about the bank card.
Yeah.
We had a resident that was part of her issues, that she was used to having her checkbook and her bank card. So I talked to the family and I had them give her a debit card and they would load money on it. So she would go into an outing, she would have money, but it'd only be a certain amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she still had that control.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And that's actually what I ended up doing, putting a cap on it so that she's got that card and she feels that at least some sense of control over that, right? And she guards that baby with her life. It's always like double checking her purse. Where's that bank card, right? So, but I'm finding it a really interesting negotiation with my mom, if you can, now that she's suffering from dementia, and especially as it gets a little worse all the time. I'm really changing my communication style, really being intentional about who I'm showing up as, doing a lot more listening, trying to honor where she's at. So I'd love if you have any tips on how to best navigate these negotiations or communications as our parents start losing cognition.
The first thing I want to say is just remember that they are your parents and they have a lived experience. So we tend to sometimes to treat them like children.
Yes.
And they're not your children.
Yeah.
They are adults.
Yeah.
And so they still deserve that respect as an adult and able to make as many decisions as they possibly can. You may have to limit the choices,
Yeah.
right? Because too many choices is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so it may come down to, hey, mom, we have to go out to see the doctor today. Would you like to go for lunch before or after?
Yeah.
And giving them those options and choices. So it's a way of showing that respect.
Yeah, that's great.
And remember, you're not taking over every aspect of their life. So anything they can make a decision on, allow that and be okay with it.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a resident that wore her ruby red slippers every day. She had these, they're really cute, but that's what she liked. We had another lady that insisted on wearing high heels every day.
Wow.
So we put them on. We had another one that liked to wear her girdle every day. I don't know why, but we put it on.
Not comfortable.
No, but that's what she did. I mean, she worked in the factory and wore that girdle every day. So she felt undressed without it. Those are the negotiations you have to make. Fight the battles that you have to and let the small stuff go.
Yeah.
So if she wants to wear plaids and stripes today, let her.
Yeah. Yeah. Choice. That's so important, right? Because we all want to be treated with dignity and respect. And, we have this incredible lived experience, as you say. And, I think we do have that tendency to want to take over, and sometimes coming from a place of love. I'm sure that family who were lying to their mom, they thought they were doing it out of love, but that's going to end up leading to resentment. So on that, do you have any strong sort of do's or don'ts, or what you would say are most common mistakes in dealing with our parents as they age?
I would say the biggest do, make sure you talk to them about their wishes while you can.
Yeah.
While they're able to make those decisions. Do they want to have a feeding tube if it becomes necessary? Would they like to have IV hydration? Would they want antibiotics? Those questions you'll want to make sure you have answered and get a living will.
Yeah.
And then set up the power of attorney and explain to them, hey, the power of attorney comes in effect when you can't make decisions.
Yeah.
So as long as you can make the decisions, I don't have any control over that.
Yeah.
But when you can't and you're incapacitated, that's when I can come in and explain to them that way. And a lot of times if you come from a place of, I'm looking out for you to take care of you. So if something happens, we'll know what to do. And don't be afraid to have those conversations about what they would want at end of life. What you want to communicate is, I want to do what you want. Right. And then be open and listen to that and have those conversations. The other thing, the big don't assume.
Yeah.
Don't assume that you would know. That's right.
Yeah.
Like we had thought my dad would want to be buried because my mom wants to be buried. Dad wants to be cremated. He said that forever. So we're going to honor those wishes.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, don't forget to include others in the family in the conversation. Mm-hmm. That's important too.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a nursing home or whatever, I'm going to tell you as a clinician, it's always easier to deal with one family member.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the family, and then that family member explains it to the rest of the family. So be careful with having all the cooks in the kitchen at the same time. That's chaos. But have that point person and then have family discussions so that you don't have those issues where Aunt Sally from out of state never knew what her sister wanted, and then she's upset because things didn't go the way she thought they should. Have those conversations and then help them through every transition. So maybe mom's able to stay home and live independently for the most part, but maybe she needs a little extra help. Yeah. And maybe the house is too big. So maybe we can help her downsize, and then decisions need to be made about that. And, make a plan for each phase and stage, whether we ever get there or not. It's better to plan it out than to have to go, at the spare moment and try to figure this out. It's hard to do it on the fly. But if you know that, okay, mom's going to live in this senior living community, but right next door, they have an assisted living. So maybe she can, needs to get out of the condo and she needs more help. We can move her right there. And hey, you know what? If she becomes really sick and really can't take care of herself, then there's skilled care at this other building right next door. So you look at those things. The other thing is make sure you understand who all their providers are and keep a list of the medications and the treatments that they've had. a lot of times people have multiple specialists that they see, and generally the family practice provider is the one that's managing all that and coordinating all that, but that's not always the case.
Yeah.
I work in psychiatry right now, and one of my clients from the assisted living came in and said to me, "You are giving me all these medications." And I'm like, "I just met you. I'm not giving you anything." But let's look at your list. And
Yeah.
so because no one else was willing to do it,
Yeah.
I went ahead and submitted for all of her medical records, and I went through her medical records and I wrote down her med list, and I said, okay, this doctor gives you this for this. This doctor gives you that for that. And I made a chart for her, gave it to her and her sister. I said, now these are the 3 medicines I'm giving you.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm giving it to you. So the rest of this, you go back to those providers and ask them, is this necessary?
Yeah.
She had 5 pages of medications, and a lot of them were duplicates,
Yeah.
but the other doctors didn't know that what she was on. So they were just adding on all these things. So we're able to cut her med list down.
Yeah. And so important about that communication, because I think we often procrastinate because we think it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation with our loved one. But, knowing what they want on those simple decisions, like you say, even, do you want hydration? Do you want to, antibiotics or whatever? So important. And and you've touched on some of these in that answer as well, but I found it to be a very interesting negotiation navigating the healthcare system, right? And the long-term care system. Any tips or advice you have for us on that?
Ask questions, visit often.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to come into those care plan meetings and really ask them to walk you through what's happening and what your options are. A lot of people don't know that they can have their own medical provider, and you can have them go to their family doctor that they had an outpatient. Yeah. They may not know that they can decline certain services. Yeah. And so you need to know what your rights are and what your family members' rights are. Yeah. The other thing is ask questions. If you're looking to place someone into a facility, ask questions about their staffing ratios.
Yes.
And then visit off shift. So don't just go at daytime when everybody's there, administration's in the building, but go at night. Yeah. Go in the evening. See what it's like. Talk to the other residents, right? Look at the facility and see, does it seem to be in disrepair? Is there torn carpeting somewhere? Are there odd smells that shouldn't be there? I mean, occasionally you'll have that, but all the time, are the clothing that the residents in, do they look stained? Do they look disheveled? Is their hair combed? Because that's going to tell you if the facility is taking care of them. And then for those of your listeners that are people of color or of different ethnicities or cultural backgrounds, is the staff culturally competent?
Yes. Yes.
Do they know how to prepare your hair? Right. Yeah. Or take care of whatever ritual you have. So I happened to work in one facility that was a Jewish home, and they celebrated all the Jewish holidays. Well, in one of my other facilities, it was not a Jewish home, and one of the residents was Jewish. And so she was really upset that they didn't celebrate a lot of the Jewish holidays. They just celebrate Christian holidays. And so I talked to the administration. I said, hey, listen, we need to make sure that we're celebrating everyone's holiday. And so when her holidays come up, make sure you have something for her. There's Christmas parties and Easter things, but there's nothing for other things. So we need to be more inclusive and understand people's rituals. I mean, I had the woman that didn't like coffee, but she liked tea. Yeah. So we need to make sure that we accommodate all of those things and ask them about that. And then make sure that you keep in contact, not just with the administration, but also talk to the CNAs. The CNAs are the eyes and ears of the facility. Yeah. So they often know what's going on before anybody else does. Okay, they're always there. It's kind of funny. It's like I would listen to the residents chatter when I'm there. And for some reason, the residents will tell me things that they may not tell other staff. Like, my food was cold and the microwave's broken. I said, well, okay, that's a maintenance request, but I'll let them know. But they'll tell me because I was taking care of them. I'm closest to them. And so when I was a CNA, they would tell me everything. And so make sure that you talk to the CNAs because they're going to know if mom had a bad night or not. The nurse may or may not know because she's probably got 30 people to take care of. Yeah. Yeah. But the CNA will probably know. Yeah.
Such good advice. These are great tips. Oh my gosh. And make sure for anybody out there, for our listeners, if this is something that's new to you, again, feel free to re-listen to this episode, take notes, share it with anybody that you know is going through this experience or about to embark on this experience. These are some great tips. I wish I chatted to you at the beginning of this journey, but always better late than never. And I really love the point you've made about that inclusion and diversity, because that I think we don't sometimes think about the cultural sort of appropriateness and their ability to meet those needs. I think it's so important. I love that. And I can't believe, Tina, how fast our time is going here. This is crazy. So what's something you know now that you wish you knew when you first started?
I think the biggest thing I wish I knew was how the funding works and how nursing homes get paid and reimbursed, and how that impacts your care. And so a lot of facilities are funded by the state. So if your state doesn't put in enough funding for those Medicaid beds, because most of the residents, when they're long-term, they're on Medicaid. And so that payer source, Medicaid doesn't pay as well as Medicare. And so having families understand what happens when the Medicare runs out for their tab days and they switch to Medicaid and all those different things. I wish I had known how that really played and how the nursing home gets reimbursed, how things are billed, and how it impacts their care. I had one facility tell me that they had to feed their residents. Each resident was allotted $3 a day for their meals.
Yeah. Wow. How do you do that? Good grief.
Yes. So when you think about that, what does that mean for quality?
Yeah, that's outrageous.
And because they had to meet budget, because that's what their parent company says. And so those are things I know that are happening in the legislature on the federal level. I just left a seminar just about this plan by the Institutes of Medicine that they just brought out about long-term care. And so there's talk about changing some of that at the federal level and how nursing home residents funds are allocated and how they're distributed. And it varies from state to state. And that's an important thing to know. You need to know what the laws are in your state and how it affects your residents. And it can depend on if you're in a smaller facility that's family owned, or if you're in a facility that's owned by a large for-profit corporation. Yeah. So that I wish I had known, because I could have helped some of my families make more informed decisions.
So good. Thank you for that. And again, for our listeners out there, just really put a pin in that to remind you, find out what your rights are. I mean, Tina's mentioned that a couple of times through the episode here today. And I think that's such an important point worth mentioning again. And whatever jurisdiction you're in, right? Know the difference between federal versus state law in the US. Know the difference between federal versus provincial law in Canada. Wherever you're joining us from, make sure you check both sort of at the national level and at the more local level, what your rights are. And do your homework always with any negotiation, do your preparations. So important. And Tina, I'd love to end. I always like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts you've ever had in your life? Again, doesn't have to be on this issue. This can be just any one of those aha moments that sort of changed how you think or show up.
I think for me, it's just being my authentic self. We often have this persona of I have to be very professional, et cetera, et cetera. And to a certain extent you do. But what I found the easiest and best way to connect with my clients, and whether they're residents or attorneys, right, is to be my authentic self and let them see me. Yeah. And so that's very important. And so that's my biggest mindset shift.
I love that. I think that's beautiful. And that applies to everything, right? Like all of our negotiating, whether you're dealing with the long-term care staff, right? Whether you're dealing with your mom or dad who's, aging or dementia, and, whether you're negotiating personally and professionally. I think we often are, people, especially now with all the talk around negotiating and everybody is practicing showing up in a role that they think is expected of them rather than just being their authentic self. So I think that's such beautiful advice. Well, Tina, thank you so much. This has been just so informative. Lots of great, valuable tips here and perspective shifts, I think, for people in terms of how to show up differently, how to be informed, and how to navigate and negotiate through what can be a really difficult period with more grace. So thank you so much for being here and sharing with us.
Thank you.
And for everybody out there as well, if you want to find out more about Tina, we're going to make sure to put in the show notes. You can check her out on LinkedIn at Tina Baxter and on website at baxterprofessionalservices.com. Make sure to check that out as well, and check out some of the services that Tina offers if you are experiencing something and would like some assistance. So I am sure you have got just loads of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. And like I mentioned earlier, be sure to share this episode with anyone that you think could benefit from this message. Anyone who is either concerned for themselves or dealing with a loved one or anticipating that there's going to be an issue, make sure to share this episode so that they can get those all important tips. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so that you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.